Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session on young and emerging evaluators and advocacy spaces. Next slide. We are at EvalYouth North America. We're a regional chapter that's part of EvalYouth Global Network. We support the goals of promoting young and emerging evaluators to be technically sound, experienced, and well-networked professionals, and that are also included in the evaluation field. Today's session is part of Youth and Evaluation Week. Today marks the first day. And in today's session, we're highlighting different experiences of young and emerging evaluators that are working in advocacy roles. And today, the session will be moderated by Olivia Melvin and me as well, Lydia Ottogay. And I will start with introducing the panelists that we have, and then we'll jump into some questions. So first up, we have Nani Rispoli, who's an independent evaluation consultant based in Manila, Philippines. She has over 3 years of experience as an evaluator, where most of her work has focused on qualitative evaluations for education and United Nations clients. Before entering the evaluation field, she spent 7 years in the international development sector. She's worked on projects with government agencies and civil society in several East and Horn of Africa countries. She holds a Master of Evaluation from the University of Melbourne, first class honors, and a Master of Law from the University of Cambridge, first class, where she was a Commonwealth Shared Scholar. She also graduated from the University of Cape Town with an LLB degree. Our next panelist is Malka Elkin, who has been a data and evaluation analyst at GIS Toronto since 2021, where she leads internal program evaluations to support the newcomer serving organization and demonstrating service impact and making evidence-based decisions. In 2023, Malka started to support other nonprofit organizations as an evaluation consultant. She has a background in social work and experience in frontline community-based work in mental health and settlement sectors that she applies to her evaluation role. In 2022, Malka completed a diploma in public policy and program evaluation from Carleton University, and she's also a board member of EvalYouth North America. Our next panelist is Sarah Lubelski, who is an evaluation officer at Indigenous Services Canada. Her current evaluation focuses on Indigenous-led engagement and methodologies, and she serves as the gender-based analysis and ambassador for the evaluation branch. In her academic work, she specializes in systemic marginalization within organizational structures. Our other panelist is Jakaya Bryant, who's an evaluation associate at the Center for Research Evaluation, where she serves on the Children, Families, and Communication team. She serves health and education clients in her portfolio to identify, track, and achieve their program goals. She's a recent graduate of the University of Mississippi, where she received her Bachelor of Science degree in Public Health and Health Sciences, concentrating in community health with a minor in mathematics. She's also investigated the impact of education and economic development and poverty alleviation, and has worked throughout communities in Mississippi and New York. Next slide. Our other panelist is Matthew Hancock, who serves as an evaluation associate at the Center for Research Evaluation. Matthew received a BA in sociology from Louisiana State University in 2015 and completed a dual title MS in rural sociology and international agriculture and development from the Pennsylvania State University in 2020. His work is currently situated in a K-12 portfolio and covers a wide breadth of individual and institutional evaluation contexts. Prior to joining Center for Research Evaluation, Matthew worked primarily in international research context focused on rural livelihood and health, fertility, food security, and the determinants of population change. His skill set is tailored to quantitative analysis and focuses on applied and mixed methodologies, and he has extensive prior experience working on interdisciplinary teams. Our next panelist is Dr. Izzy Thornton, who is a multi-method applied sociologist and data scientist with demonstrated experience in studies of childhood, educational inequality, and health disparities. She serves as a principal at the Evaluation Association within the Center for Research Evaluation at the University of Mississippi. She began there in 2022 after completing her PhD in sociology from Mississippi State University. Prior to her doctoral studies, she also earned her BA in sociology, a BSW in social work, and an MS in sociology. And then our final panelist, Linnea Wallace, is a creative individual who recently graduated from CCC with a medical billing and coding license. Her ultimate goal is to become an OBGYN, and she is planning to further her education by pursuing an LPN program starting this fall. She's a loving mother to her 19-year-old daughter, Araya. In her free time, she enjoys reading and writing poems, showcasing her creative side. She's also actively involved in Teen Health MS, where she contributes to projects like Mind Evaluation and Work Wonders, demonstrating her commitment to promoting health and well-being in her community. Welcome to all the panelists, and we're so glad you can be here with us today. I'll pass it over to Olivia.
This was going to be a challenge trying to find the unmute button. All right. With that being said, we're going to jump into some questions that we created. I know as the panelists, y'all have seen these before. If there's anything that you feel particularly comfortable responding to, please go ahead. You don't have to answer every question. The audience can also request that somebody speak to a question, but please, again, feel no pressure if you don't feel comfortable speaking to it. So to kick us off, does anybody want to tell us about your relationship between advocacy and evaluation in your current or previous roles?
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. I feel like this is the story that I tell all the time. My path to evaluation actually started when I was not in academia. So in early undergrad, I was working in the nonprofit 501c3 sector, doing a lot of work with social justice nonprofits in and around Mississippi and the Southeast broadly. I was mostly on a programming or direct services side of the C3 operations. So very much not in a strategic planning capacity, not in an eval capacity or anything like that. I was also 19. So in that work, I kept running into this issue of I would want to do something. I would want to produce a publication. I would want to create a flyer. I would want to create talking points for policymakers, whatever. And the response I always kept getting was, well, we'd love to do that, but we don't have the data for it. Or we'd love to do that, but we would need a data person to do that. And so in that way, eval really shaped my entire trajectory, because the option I was left with was, well, we need a data person to do that, and we don't have one. I guess I better go learn how to be a data person. So my movement into eval was really the foundation of it was in that C3 work. Then, for most of us here at our center, we are an eval center, but very few of us have degrees that say eval. Most of us have degrees in social behavioral science, education pathways, different things like that. And so having finished school now and then still working with and through those advocacy organizations over the tenure of my time in grad school, which lasted approximately forever, I've been able to kind of hone that experience. And being able to do both at the same time gave me some really great applied experience, so that by the time I finished my degree and was out on the job market, I could point to a pretty thick portfolio of applied work that I had been doing. So in that way, it's a very natural pairing for me, and a really easy question to answer. So that's why I started.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Sarah, you looked ready to respond to this as well.
Yeah, I find it's a really interesting question from my perspective, because I come from academia as well. I have a PhD where I focused more on a feminist perspective. And so advocacy was a lot more personal in that way, but also less active. I moved into evaluation, one, because academia is a very difficult environment to live in, but also because I wanted to do something with the things that I was discovering and researching and finding out, and wanted it to actually make a difference in the world around me. But when I entered my role at Indigenous Services Canada, which I might slip into just calling it ISC because the federal government is insidious with acronyms, I realized that I had to have a different relationship to the process of advocacy, simply because of who Indigenous Services Canada serves and represents. And so in a way where advocacy was more personal, when I was doing work in the gender and feminist space, it has to become slightly more removed in this space, because even though ISC says that our mandate is to support and empower Indigenous peoples towards self-determination, it is my personal belief that people empower themselves. And so there has to be a more tenuous relationship, I think, in the evaluation work that I do between evaluation and advocacy, because the evaluation work that we do at ISC has got to be Indigenous led. It has to be people, it has to be us making the space in a government context. And sometimes that is in a more unofficial way. We do have a little bit of leverage and leeway within ISC to do different things that than the rest of government is doing. But at the same time, we need to sometimes skirt the line and make new rules and create new ways of centering Indigenous thoughts and Indigenous approaches and Indigenous methodologies so Indigenous people are able to advocate for themselves. And so really the way in which advocacy plays a role in my current evaluation space is in remembering the importance of self-determination, and not necessarily for me. My voice cannot and should not be central. And that's part of the advocacy of the role I play right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Does that resonate with anybody else, or does anybody else want to share a difference in perspective of how it relates in their position? Malka, take it away.
Yeah, I'll share. I thought of 4 ways that I contribute to advocacy in some way through my evaluation role. So I'm an internal evaluator at an organization that supports newcomers to Canada. So the first way is that we use evaluation to advocate externally for our clients through sharing client needs and client experience. So we're able to, by sharing that, advocate for policy change. For example, housing, where I'm located in Toronto, housing is a huge crisis, and there are many barriers at play. So I think being able to share evidence of newcomers' experiences and their barriers, and with provincial or federal bodies who are decision makers around housing policy, is one example of the way in which we can share that information externally and advocate for their needs. The next is in terms of our own organizational needs. So evaluation allows us to have evidence about the efficacy of the services that we provide, as well as the gaps that still exist. So we can use that to advocate for increased funding to address those gaps. For example, having data to demonstrate that there's an influx of clients and an increase in the caseloads of our workers can be used to advocate for funding additional positions for workers to meet the demand, which you'd think is very simple to have that kind of data, but so many organizations don't have that kind of infrastructure to be able to advocate for increased funding and their own needs. The other is sharing data internally with the organization about client needs and wants and potential inequities that exist within the programs. So then on a smaller scale within the organization, decision makers can decide what they want the program to look like in the future that's more in line with the beneficiaries, with what the beneficiaries need and want, and to strive for increased equity as well. And the last is more on a macro level. I like to believe that this is happening to some degree, but I believe that evaluation can be used to dispel misconceptions about certain populations. It provides evidence about the needs as well as the strengths of different groups. So speaking within my own context of the work that I do, in the public discourse, there's sadly a narrative about immigrants taking advantage of government supports or not being able to support themselves. But in my role, we're able to actually collect data, have evidence that can show that our clients are indeed hard workers, many of them making a concerted effort to find employment despite the numerous barriers that exist for them. So I believe that sharing that information and actually having evidence in a small way can work to shift the narrative. So I consider that to be a form of advocacy as well.
Thank you so much. Did anybody else want to speak to this question before we move to the next? A little bit of silence. Okay.
I'll hop in, Olivia.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so my kind of relationship between advocacy and evaluation in my previous role was non-existent. And this was when I was working in the international development sector, where my role was essentially just to put it bluntly, to sell a program that was funded by an international donor to governments in the Eastern Horn of Africa. And it was extremely frustrating to work in that particular role because there was only a summative evaluation, like at the complete end, money for an evaluation at the end of the project. And there was no sort of mechanism in between to kind of evaluate what we were doing. And we were getting a lot of feedback from the government that we were working with, and also the civil society we're working with as well, that this program isn't meeting our needs. And I had this role, which was to kind of create demand for the program so that it could meet its objectives. And I felt extremely frustrated in that position because it was not an evaluation position. It was not an advocacy position. It was this sort of project officer position where I was hearing something from people who this program was supposed to serve. And there was no mechanism to kind of get this information to the donors, to the funders of the program. And there was no formal mechanism, and it was also quite political as well. And this is probably something we'll touch on later in our discussion about how politics can affect advocacy and the evaluation process. So it's that kind of frustration, being in a situation where I had no advocacy role. I wasn't an evaluator. I knew very little about evaluation, and just feeling extremely frustrated. And that shaped my journey and led me to move from working on the kind of project end as a project implementer to the evaluation path. So it's that frustration that led me to where I am now. So it's just a different perspective of how I landed in this position.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next question. On that note, what are some of the challenges related to serving in advocacy roles in your evaluation practice? Are the two ever distinctly separate, or do you see advocacy and evaluation as inherently intertwined? And I know this will differ really broadly based on everybody's different roles. I want to first offer for Lanila, Jokaya, or Matt to talk since y'all haven't yet, but then we'll open it up to everybody again.
I can go first, I guess. So I would say some of the challenges related to serving in advocacy and balancing evaluation is a lot of times when we're brought on to projects, especially at our role at SEER, we're supposed to be serving as more of an objective eye, being an outsider looking into the organization and trying to offer them recommendations and solutions to kind of use the resources they have to get to a better impact or get to a better goal. And that can be a challenge in a bunch of ways, especially when you're on projects that are distinctly close to your heart or things that you have been involved in the past or in your past work. So for me, that type of work kind of serves as a challenge. Also balancing all the stakeholder interests when serving an evaluation. I feel like a lot of times on projects, there can be competing interests and the impact that people want to see and the impact that other people on the team want to see. So trying to pinpoint a place of importance and trying to find common threads and common themes to keep people together and connected is another challenge. And of course, the constraints of resources. When you're working with different types of organizations and different types of people, there are different levels to resources and money access that they do have. So combining all of that create a whole slur of challenges that can take place when working on one project or the other. And to speak to the second question, I feel as though in evaluation, we would like to be our advocacy and our evaluation to be kind of separate, but in a way they're just inherently intertwined. Because the way that we advocate for our stakeholders or advocate for our nonprofits and the people that we serve is also being very informed about the work that they do. And in the spaces where they cannot show up, we show up a lot, especially since we're supposed to serve as that objective eye. So really understanding the community that we serve, understanding the work that they do, serve to us as a benefit, because we get to see a lot of the behind the scenes mechanisms and outcomes that outward facing populations don't really get to see. So the way that we shape our recommendations, the way that we shape how the program should impact the community, inherently serves advocacy in a way, because we have an understanding that they don't. So for me, I always see it as something that's intertwined.
Thank you.
I go next. One challenge related to serving advocacy roles and evaluation practice is maintaining objectivity, ensuring that the evaluation process is not biased by the advocacy goals. It can be difficult to separate the two at times, but it is important to maintain the integrity of the evaluation process. And to answer the second one, it is possible for advocacy and evaluation to be distinctly separate, but they are often inherently intertwined, especially when advocating for evidence-based policies or programs. People need to understand that advocacy in the field of evaluation is about using data and evidence to drive change and improve outcomes. Also, it could be funding issues, like you could have this idea and have the people to, get the ideas from, but you may not always have the funds to do it. So that could also be another challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So yeah, anybody have a different perspective than what we've heard so far on this question? Who wants to speak to this next?
I can hop in on this. I think from my perspective, while they are necessarily intertwined within the majority of our work, I think that for certain projects and in certain roles as evaluators, they have to remain distinct, in that our role as an evaluator is often completely separate and often at odds with our roles in advocacy positions, in that we are not necessarily, I wouldn't say allowed, but it doesn't behoove the projects that we're on or necessarily the funders that we are with to advocate for certain groups in place of others, if that makes any sense. To where I feel that my kind of background and roles and kind of data-driven decision making and kind of rural sociology and trying to advocate for those spaces, I often find that those type of views or the data that we may be providing is not necessarily supportive or representative of the entire community. So I feel that kind of navigating those complexities within advocacy and evaluation practices, it's a very nuanced approach. And I think that trying to come back to like what Jokaya was saying with objectivity, in that being our role, sometimes advocacy doesn't have a role in that space. I think that's kind of my view on this.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to just jump in because I like this question, because I think there's some anterior questions we need to answer before we can form like a position on it. Like, what do I think my role is as an evaluator? And can evaluators be like neutral arbiters, like who make value-free judgments and are apolitical and are objective? And what do we mean by being objective? And I think underlying all of this is unpacking our paradigms and our worldviews that we bring to our work. Like, what assumptions and beliefs do I bring to my work about what constitutes valid methods? What is reality? For example, is there an objective truth that exists out there? Or is truth kind of multifaceted? How is knowledge created? What constitutes valid knowledge? I think all of these are such fundamental and foundational questions that necessarily scaffold our position on whether advocacy and evaluation are inherently intertwined. And in my evaluation kind of self-learning journey, I've been really grateful for the reading that I've done, especially Donna Mertens and Amy Wilson's work on Christie and Alkin's evaluation tree. And this evaluation tree has different branches. And one of the branches is a social justice branch that comes under the transformative paradigm. And it's this idea that evaluators and evaluation has a role in transforming society in line with social justice values. And I've been thinking about my values, and I realized that they align with that kind of view, that I think evaluators have skin in the game. And we have to be transparent about the values and the worldviews and the positions that are guiding our evaluations in our work, in our conversations with all stakeholders involved in the evaluation process. But we should be explicit about it, because when we discuss objectivity, when we discuss neutrality and all these sorts of concepts, I think there's something lurking underneath them. I think there are political values that are underlying these sort of terms like objectivity and neutrality. And often I think they're there to uphold kind of status quo and are small c conservative views. So that's my position. And I think my role as an emerging evaluator is to be explicit about what I'm bringing to the table and how I see my work. And the link to advocacy is that inevitably the methods that I choose will be influenced by the desire to see social justice and change in our societies, because what else then is the point of doing evaluation if not to somehow improve society? And then inevitably there's going to be different views and perspectives about what that practically means. But I think it's important to be transparent and clear about that from the get-go. So unpacking these concepts such as objectivity and neutrality, I think, is really, really important. And are we really being objective when we say we're being objective? What's lurking beneath these sorts of terms? I think that's really important.
Thank you so much for that. You have also just articulated a lot of the existential dread that I felt coming into the field with my imposter phenomenon of trying to figure out if I fit into what these definitions were as a young and emerging evaluator. But Sarah, you look like you're about to say something.
Yeah, I can't agree more, honestly, with what you just said. I think self-reflexivity is an incredibly important part of this process. I'm someone who does not believe in the possibility of neutrality or objectivity. I don't think objectivity is a real thing because everyone has a context. My team distributes, for everyone that we engage on our evaluations, we distribute a positionality document which introduces every member of the team, gives you a background on who we are, where we come from, what kind of things might influence sort of who we are as individuals. We found this to be incredibly important in working with the communities we work with, when their first question about you is often not at all what do you do, but who are you? Who are your people? Where do you come from? And so being able to kind of share that aspect of ourselves and knowing that that is inherently intertwined with the work that we are doing and the way that we interact with the populations we interact with, I think is incredibly essential. So Noni, I love what you said, and I completely agree that these ideas have to be unpacked, and the idea that we come at this work as evaluators, you know, we're humans, we're coming at it as human beings, and that can't be undone or ignored.
Thank you so much.
I would love to jump in and echo some of this, because, you know, from the epistemological position that I'm in, you know, I'm of the opinion that objectivity is a total myth. It's something that we use to prop up a neoliberal colonial nonsense system. And you hear it a lot, especially in the social sciences or the behavioral sciences where you collect data from people. But the fact is that information you take in through your senses can never be objective, whether that's something that you are collecting data through a survey or an interview, or whether you are reading numbers off of a beaker or a ruler. It all has to get filtered through the lens of your perception anyway, and that comes with some skew. And I know that that was a lot of theory words, but I want to give you a really concrete example from when I was still doing work as a youth evaluator. My early work was in Mississippi in LGBTQ youth spaces. This would have been 2008, 2009. And at the time, the only data collection instrument that we had that was representative statewide of youth was the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, URBIS. And other states had an identifier on URBIS so that respondents could report their sexual orientation and gender identities. It ended up being really useful for showing statistically how many LGBTQ kids that you had in one area or another. Without inclusion on the YRBS, and therefore without being able to say X% of children in this school district identify as LGBTQ, we could not convince policymakers that there were LGBTQ kids in Mississippi public schools. And the fact of us being LGBTQ kids and showing up, having that identity and being students in those systems, or telling stories of our classmates and peers, even through qualitative interviewing and systematic data collection, none of that was valid enough to convince policymakers without a statistical backup. And that really comes back to what we were talking about in terms of what counts as knowledge and who gets to decide, right? Because I can tell you for sure there are gay kids in the school district because I go to school here and I'm gay, but that knowledge is not something that counts in a way that was useful to policymakers. And at the same time, the only thing that was a way to count in a way that was useful to policymakers was something that had a lot of structural barriers between a bunch of kids and getting those data. The process to get an item included on the YRBS is really tenuous, and we worked on it. We weren't successful in getting that item added to the Mississippi YRBS until 9 years later. And so I say that to say, for all the talk of epistemology and objectivity and what counts, sometimes you get really clear examples of why what counts as knowledge and what doesn't count as knowledge matters for the relationship between advocacy and evaluation work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Izzy. All right.
Could I just hop on? And I think that's such interesting points by Sarah and Izzy. And I'm just looking at it from a kind of historical perspective when you think about how there's so much gatekeeping around knowledge and what counts as valid knowledge, what counts as valid data collection methods. And it sounds like, Izzy, if I'm not mistaken, that the policymakers in your example wanted hard data and statistics, numbers, and your sort of lived experience, your stories weren't valid and they didn't count. And I think of my experience working in the Eastern Horn of Africa and how expertise was often limited to people who had certain qualifications, certain degrees in advanced statistical data crunching and so on. But people who had other forms of knowledge that were not valued were kind of sidelined, and their voices were marginalized. And by extension, their role in the evaluation was not important, even though they had a lot to contribute to speak on an intervention or a program. And I think that that has a detrimental effect, like you mentioned, Izzy, because they are structural barriers that make it difficult, for example, for people to get the sort of education that is considered valid, the qualifications that are considered valid, And who gets to decide that that's the only way of knowing, that's the only way of understanding our physical world, our social world? And there's so much gatekeeping around it, and so much is built on big isms, you know, imperialism, on racism, on also the just exclusion of people, and I think that's a big issue. I think that's why I'm kind of very much of the view that we need to unpack the language we use as young and emerging evaluators, that we shouldn't take things as face value, and we should spend time in terms of educating ourselves. And I think that example you gave, Izzy, is great because it kind of concretizes some of the issues I've been thinking about as somebody who's relatively new to the field.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Anna.
I'm gonna move to the next question because I see we've got 20 minutes left. What do people need to know about advocacy in the field of evaluation? What would be your all's like one sentence takeaway or one paragraph takeaway? I won't limit you. If you can do it in one word, I'll be really impressed. Did anyone have strong feelings about this question?
I'll give you this, but it's not one word. I'd strongly suggest you go read Audre Lorde's piece about the master's tools in the master's house. And remember that when you are doing funded evaluation work, you are generating knowledge for the people who have the resources to pay to have knowledge generated.
Great quote from Audre Lorde.
Lanila, did you want to add something?
Oh, I thought somebody else was saying something. I heard something. I was just gonna say that I think people should know that advocacy within the field of evaluation plays a significant role in promoting social change, influencing policy changes, and improving program effectiveness. Also, I think that they should be aware of the ethics part of advocacy, meaning it's just maintaining objectivity, transparency, and advocacy roles and ethical conduct are crucial to uphold credibility to this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
I would just add that balancing the role of evaluator and advocate can be challenging. But using the data strategically, participating in capacity building, like helping other people understand evaluation is more of a tool. Because I think a lot of times in communities, it can be seen in a very negative light, especially in communities where a lot of mistrust happens. And engaging those communities can help bridge the gap of being an evaluator and also being an advocate, especially in roles that we play where we're offering the recommendations and we can't take them. It's important to empower the communities to understand what to do with the recommendations that we give them, and not to just spew out data, spew out evidence, and not really give them the tools and the knowledge of how to continue to carry that evaluation and how to use it for themselves, and how to like they said, like ask great questions, question what people are saying to you, and also have that internal question asking happening within the organization, not just external people coming in and asking questions, but how do I continually challenge the people who are coming through this place and within this place to make this place better.
It's also somewhat impossible to not have a contextually responsive lens to what we do in terms of like, if you're truly embedding advocacy and evaluation, you have to be able to make those recommendations that fit the context, that are going to be feasible and applicable for the communities you're working with. So just the importance of going into things with that contextually and culturally responsive lens to even be able to do the work in a way that will be capable of making the difference that the community wants to see. Feels really important in this. Is there anything else y'all wanted to add to this question? feel like I just started talking on turbo speed. Let me take a deep breath. Question 4. How can evaluators and evaluation adjacent folks advocate for youth and young emerging evaluators in practice? So not just youth advocacy, not just advocacy for community, but advocating for young and emerging evaluators in that space, working in these transformative ways, working to debunk some of the status quo and like alter the way things have always been done. What would y'all say for this question? Malka, I haven't heard you in a little bit. You got anything on this one?
I had a response more focused on the advocating for youth piece because in my role, I'm the sole evaluator. I am a young and emerging evaluator, but it's advocating for myself essentially in this role. So I am unfortunately not given too many opportunities to advocate for other Y's. But in terms of advocating for youth, I think it's so important with all populations, but with this population in particular, to really show them that you are honoring and respecting their ideas and that they are being heard. I think the second they sense that you're not hearing them or not understanding them, something I've observed is that they could tend to disengage quite quickly. So something that I really try to do when I am working with youth in any evaluation is to really validate what they're saying, make sure that I understand that I'm understanding them correctly and give them the opportunity to correct me if I have made any mistakes. And then when it comes to the decision makers, that they actually do incorporate, I mean, and this is part is a challenge because it's a little bit outside of my control, but they want to know that action is being taken based on what they've shared. So I think just communicating that as clearly as I can to those decision makers, because they want to know that their time sharing, their valuable time that they've given to sharing their ideas are not, falling on deaf ears and that it's really going to make a difference. So that's something that I've particularly noticed with this population. As well, and again, this is also more universal to all populations, but just choosing the right method for collecting data. I was evaluating a teen program that we had, and there's a little bit of pressure sometimes. I don't know if other people have experienced this, to just use surveys because people are so into quantitative that that's like the truer form of evidence. But we felt that for this population, it just wasn't effective. We weren't getting the depth of information that we needed. So going back to the challenges question, it's then on me to be a little bit insistent about changing the methods. And we'd settled on smaller focus groups with like 2 or 3 people and found that was such a better way to engage them. They felt more comfortable being in the small group. The shyer kids were able to speak up a little bit more rather than a larger group. And it was more resource intensive. Of course, that took a lot longer than just, dispersing or deploying a survey. So that's what I've come up with for trying to advocate for youth in my work.
That was perfect. Thank you. Sarah, you looked like you were ready to go for it too.
Sure. I focused on the advocating for young and emerging evaluators in practice aspect of this. So I was thinking more along the lines of what do we do to set the stage for youth and emerging evaluators, and how do we encourage kind of them to develop as professionals and participate in these spaces. We have a student program at Indigenous Services, and currently my team has 2 students. And I think that what we've realized is really important is to give young and emerging evaluators a lot of agency over what it is they're able to produce. So we ask them what kind of projects they want to be involved in, what they're interested in as part of the evaluation process. And there's a lot of trust that goes into that as well, a lot of trust for what their perspective is and what they bring to the team. So, we want to know what they want to learn and what they want to develop, and then we're here to support that. in a variety of ways. So if it's, if it's interviewing, then it might be that, okay, like we're gonna get them involved in note taking and then maybe progress to interviewing at some point. And that's really, our success depends on, and our future success really depends on encouraging young evaluators and enabling them to develop their skills and really, really placing a lot of value on what it is they bring to the table and their opinions as well. And I think that that is incredibly important to do, and they should feel heard in the spaces that we have, because if we're going to, especially for a group like this, if a bunch of people who are very interested in advocacy, we need to practice we need to practice our politics in our workplaces, and not just in terms of the evaluation we do, but in terms of the workplace we create.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. I was just gonna add that I feel like a huge part of advocacy is, like Sarah mentioned, which is teaching. Teaching others, giving them the space to learn and make mistakes, especially earlier on in your career. I always tell people that a good indicator of success is not like the sustainability that happens with your direct involvement, but even after you leave, like, have you created pathways behind you for other people to come up into your role? Have you taught them how to do this job and how to ask those hard questions? So I would say, for one, the best way to advocate for someone is to teach them how to use the tools that they have to get to the place where they want to be. And a lot of times it may not be in your direct position or your direct role, but to have a lasting influence and to empower people to center communities and to decenter themselves in this process is something that you can only learn by experience. And so I really feel like that is a key thing to do when, for young and emerging evaluators in this space, and even for youth who don't want to be in this space but still want to learn and to grow in different ways on how to advocate for their community. Evaluation is always a tool that will always be relevant, because it teaches us to understand the what, the why, and if it's working and if it's not working. So it's always something that somebody can have in their toolbox that can be useful.
Absolutely.
At the risk of talking too much, I just want to note I dropped a couple of sources into chat that are really more about collecting data with young people. A lot of my work is grounded in the idea that young people experience marginalization relative to adults in the same way that other marginalized groups experience marginalization. And so there's a lot of work about what a social justice informed approach to data collection and interpretation with young people looks like. So I dropped 3 links because they have some really cool hands-on methods, actually, like how to translate this work from theory into practice, 1. And then 2, all 3 are from academic presses. And sometimes when you are trying to justify a method that may be novel in your institution or office or whatever, citing things that are published by academic presses can be useful. So that may be useful to y'all, and I hope it is.
Thank you, Izzy. And you're not talking too much. I'll make you talk again before it's over. Moving to question 5, what advice would you give to someone interested in working at the intersection of advocacy and evaluation? Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that y'all think is important to bring up as a piece of advice here?
I'd say to read widely, but don't get overwhelmed. Izzy mentioned Audre Lorde, for example, as her famous quote about dismantling. I don't have it, but dismantling the master's house with the master's tools. You can't do that, basically. Freestyling it there. But Audre Lorde, for example, wasn't an evaluator. She was a writer, poet, an activist, and I don't think we as emerging and young evaluators should limit the sources that we go for inspiration, to kind of develop our self-knowledge of our values and the worldview we bring to our evaluations. I think that we should be in alignment with the evaluation discipline, which is very open to borrowing ideas from sociology, philosophy, psychology, and so on. We should continue to practice that kind of openness to ideas as young and emerging evaluators. And that's why I think it's so important to read widely, but not be overwhelmed, because it's going to be a career-long learning process. And there's been so much written in the past that we can build on and refine our views based on what journalists have said, what historians have said, what anthropologists and sociologists have said, and activists have said, and so on. And that necessarily entails investing time and energy in thinking about evaluation and the way of doing evaluations, not just the kind of nuts and bolts of it, but kind of taking a step back and thinking about the big picture too. I think that will move the discipline forward as we kind of take over as a younger generation, particularly because of the challenges that are facing our generation and the next generation are really existential when you think of climate change, for example. And the extremism and radicalization and living in a post-truth kind of world where, because I read it on social media, it must be true. These are really wicked problems that we are going to face. So we need to come prepared by having at least a theoretical foundation that can guide us through these challenges, and as we evaluate programs and kind of push the needle forward and not essentially maintain the status quo. And I think inherently that also involves practicing reflexivity. Sarah mentioned that, she touched on it. So reflecting on our role and our situatedness, and striving to be aware about our assumptions and our models and our values and how they may be affecting what we see and hear, and being very aware of our blind spots and open to having discussions with even people who may not share our same values and viewpoints for constructive kind of deliberation and debate. I think that's really important.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to add one more thing to this? No? Okay. How do you practice centering youth and young and emerging evaluators in your work? Does anybody want to round us out with this question? Izzy's a supervisor, not to volunteer you or anything.
This is something that is a challenge, and I am in the ongoing process of working with it. I am an evaluator in a university context. That means that my capacity to hire people is subject to a lot of institutional gatekeeping, and the people I am allowed to hire have to have terminal degrees in many cases, graduate degrees in most cases. Just in terms of the number of years you have to be alive to do that, it often puts a roadblock in between my capacity to like bring on emerging and youth evaluators. Like, I typically get to hire for mid-career roles. However, there are a lot of contract mechanisms that we've been able to put in place to bring in folks. And then also, you know, the evaluation work that we do as professionals, but we also do in conjunction with and for the people who are in the communities we evaluate. So as an example, we've got a project going with the Choctaw Nation here in Mississippi and their youth entrepreneurship development. So they are trying to teach teenagers how to start and run small businesses. While we can't bring them on in a professional capacity, what we can do is center our data collection around them and also use member checking to take our interpretations back to that group, so that we say, you know, I don't have the opportunity to bring you on ipso facto as a paid evaluator on this project, but what I can do is make sure that not only is your voice amplified in the findings from this project, but also that they reflect validly what your experiences are.
Thank you. You did great being put on the spot.
Yeah, thanks, Liv.
Does anybody else want to answer this question? We've got time for maybe one more person before we close out.
I just want to add that I think it's important to celebrate the contributions of young and emerging evaluators, instead of having them sort of in the background, maybe doing, research work or anything else. Like when, being able to give them the opportunities to shine and then really recognizing when that happens, recognizing their contributions to our teams, raising people up in that way to say, you know what, you did great work and this is wonderful. And I think that's a really important thing that helps, put a spotlight on our young and emerging evaluators, but also, gives them enthusiasm for the role and the drive they need to keep moving because they know that, they are a recognized part of this work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Oops. Well, thank you all for being here today. This has been phenomenal. I'm so glad you're all in the same space, can thought share across the different groups. I know that I talked to most of you all way too much, and if you haven't gotten to talk to me for more than 20 minutes prior to this, you will hear from me in the future. But we will have another event coming up on Wednesday at 12 that'll be on fostering a culture of leadership for young and emerging evaluators and evaluative spaces. It'll be the same Zoom room, so if you want to jump in on Wednesday, feel free to come back to this same link. And then we've got a QR code up, so follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. That's EvalYouth North America. And yeah, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.